He laughed. Laughed out loud, the way men accustomed to winning laugh, with his chest puffed out, utterly shameless, as if someone else's humiliation was pure entertainment. Beside him, his $3,000 an hour lawyer accompanied the laugh with a raised eyebrow in my direction, like someone looking at a thing barely worthy of notice. The whole room seemed to agree. I was sitting there alone, unrepresented, wearing a pressed blouse and shoes that had seen better days. But when the judge lowered his glasses and said the words that changed everything, I saw the blood completely drain from my husband's face. In a matter of seconds, the most arrogant man I had ever known shrank considerably, in the chair where he thought he reigned supreme. But before I continue, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel and let me know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. My name is Rachel. I'm 36 years old, and for 7 years I was exactly what Bradley needed me to be: discreet, quiet, invisible enough not to get in the way of the image he was so carefully crafting in the corporate world. While he climbed the ladder from position to position inside one of the country's largest investment banks, I stayed home, or so he thought, typing numbers into a screen, making $42,000 a year for a data management company that very few people knew by name. He saw me as someone who needed him to exist. It wasn't blatant cruelty, it was something worse. It was certainty. The quiet certainty of someone who never even entertained the possibility of being wrong about the woman sleeping next to him for 7 years. For all that time, I let that certainty grow in him like an unpruned weed. I let it happen because I had to. My real job, the job he didn't know existed, required me to be underestimated. It required me to be the unassuming wife, the 42K a year data clerk, the woman with no visible ambition who smiled at corporate dinners and stepped out of the frame when the important men arrived. Apex Forensics was a firm appointed by federal courts to audit corporate fraud, dismantle money laundering schemes, and produce forensic reports with evidentiary weight in criminal trials. It had been around for 11 years. I had been running it for 4. Our name never appeared in newspaper headlines, never in press releases, never anywhere that could be tracked by someone like Bradley. The less visible we were, the more effective we became. To Bradley's world, I was Rachel Carter, a remote employee for Quorum Data Solutions, processing spreadsheets for mid-sized corporate clients. It was the perfect cover, an identity so profoundly boring that no one would ever feel the urge to look into it. The night everything changed was a Monday in October. I had gotten home earlier than expected, carrying a bag of groceries and the exhaustion of a long week for reasons Bradley would never know. When I opened the apartment door, the first thing I noticed was a different smell. It wasn't the usual scent of air conditioning and clean carpets. It was something else. Soft, feminine, expensive. The kind of perfume a woman wears when she has absolutely no intention of hiding. The bags were in the living room. Not my travel suitcases, neatly packed with folded clothes and necessities. They were cardboard boxes and heavy-duty trash bags, the kind you use for moving or throwing out garbage. And inside them, shoved or crumpled without a single ounce of care, were my clothes. My books. The framed photo of my mother. 7 years of a shared life, piled in the center of the room like debris waiting for the dump truck. Bradley was leaning against the kitchen island with a drink in his hand and an expression I had never seen on him so clearly, not anger, not guilt, but boredom. As if I were a meeting that needed to be wrapped up quickly so he could get to the next one. He was wearing the exact same suit jacket he wore to close major acquisitions at the bank, treating this like just another business transaction. Beside him stood a woman. She must have been about 28, sleek hair, carrying the posture of someone who grew up knowing people would stare at her. She wore a structured blazer and looked at me with the kind of pity people reserve for injured animals that are beyond saving, the kind of pity that masks a massive underlying relief that it isn't them. Later, I would find out her name was Chloe, that she was an associate at one of the most cutthroat law firms in the city, and that she had far more reasons to fear me than she ever could have imagined that night. Bradley didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told me the divorce papers were already signed by him, that the settlement was finalized, and that I could take my things and leave that very night. He used the word generous to describe the terms, $30,000, which he called a courtesy payment to help with the transition. He brought up my data clerk salary like it was a punchline I should have figured out before he had to explain it to me. He said I had never truly contributed to the life we had built. He said he was moving on, that Chloe understood the world he operated in, that he needed a partner who functioned on his level. Every word was a tiny knife. I could feel the intent behind them, not just to discard me, but to break me before I even thought about fighting back. He wanted me to walk out of there shattered, terrified, convinced that I had no resources, no way out, no angle from which to retaliate. I stayed silent. Not because I was paralyzed by pain. Not because I was destroyed. I stayed silent because the part of me that had spent 7 years analyzing corporate fraud, dismantling financial rackets, and testifying as an expert witness in federal court was already at work. I was already cataloging every word, calculating every implication, planning my next move with the ice-cold precision of someone who does this for a living. Bradley interpreted my silence as defeat. I saw it in his eyes, the exact moment he decided he had won. It was the biggest mistake of his life. I grabbed only what actually mattered, a compact black case tucked away in the back of the closet, which Bradley always assumed held out-of-season winter accessories. To me, it was everything: encrypted hard drives, federal access tokens, credentials that opened systems no investment bank in America would ever want opened by unauthorized hands. I walked out without saying a word. I heard them laugh as the apartment door clicked shut behind me. Outside, a freezing drizzle was hitting the dark asphalt of New York City. I walked to a spot blind to security cameras, set the case on the ground, popped open the reinforced compartment, and pulled out my encrypted phone, the one Bradley never knew existed, issued by my division for exclusive field use. I dialed Sarah, my senior operations manager, who picked up on the second ring. Her voice was crisp, professional, without a trace of sleep, even though it was approaching midnight. I said only what needed to be said: initiate level 4 audit protocol. The target is Bradley Vance. She didn't ask any unnecessary questions. In 7 years of working with me, Sarah had learned that when I called like this, with this tone of voice, no context was needed. There was only work to be done. Understood, Director. What are the parameters? The rain beat against my coat. The street was empty. I felt a draft of cold air against the back of my neck, but it wasn't the cold making me wide awake and absolutely hyper-focused. Everything, I said. For the next 3 days, I didn't go anywhere Bradley might suspect. I didn't crash at a friend's place, I didn't check into a cheap roadside motel, and I didn't wander the city with my luggage looking like a discarded housewife. I went straight to the 18th floor of a nondescript building in Midtown Manhattan, where Apex Forensics operated under a corporate DBA so remarkably bland that nobody ever gave the lobby directory a second glance. That was the entire point. The central situation room had a full wall of monitors, and for the first 3 days, they stayed lit 24 hours a day. Sarah coordinated the analyst shifts. I stayed there until 3 in the morning, tracking the reports rolling in real time, transaction by transaction, account by account, shell company by shell company. What surfaced in the first 48 hours was enough to make any federal judge's blood boil. Bradley wasn't just hiding marital assets. He was operating as a financial middleman for the bank's high-net-worth clients who needed to move undeclared dark money offshore. The mechanism was sophisticated, carefully built over the years: phantom consulting retainers, LLCs incorporated in the Cayman Islands with generic names that wouldn't trigger automated database flags, and fractional transfers structured just below the reporting thresholds of the bank's own compliance systems. Chloe appeared as a signatory on almost every single one of those contracts. She wasn't just the girlfriend who had moved into an apartment still warm with my presence. She was the legal architect of the entire racket, the person drafting the fraudulent paperwork with the technical precision of someone who knows exactly where to bury the legal jargon to confuse a rushed auditor. It wasn't just a husband cheating on me with a younger woman. It was a criminal syndicate. And I had just accidentally been invited to tear it down. While my team worked, Bradley moved exactly the way I expected a corporate narcissist to move when he thinks he's already won, with haste and sloppiness. On the 4th day after kicking me out, he called Quorum Data Solutions, my shell company, and asked to speak to human resources. The analyst who picked up, a woman named Jessica with 10 years of deep cover operations experience, played the part of an HR manager with flawless naturality. Bradley spent 20 minutes spinning an elaborate lie. He said he was going through a messy divorce, that he had discovered I had severe financial troubles, erratic behavior, and a history of embezzlement. He said he was deeply concerned about the security of the company's client data. He asked for my immediate termination as a man-to-man favor, or, in this case, a man-to-manager favor, speaking to the woman he believed he was manipulating. Jessica agreed with everything. She feigned horror. She thanked him for the heads-up. An hour later, Bradley sent me a text. The message said he had just made me lose the only job I was qualified to get. That I had no savings, no lawyer, and no real legal recourse. That the smartest thing I could do was sign the papers, take the 30 grand, and disappear before things got even more humiliating for me. I didn't reply. Silence is the most lethal weapon against a narcissist. They fill the vacuum with the victory they imagine they've secured, they get comfortable, they get sloppy, and that opening is exactly where everything happens. That same day, in a massive, quiet house in Greenwich, Connecticut, there was a woman who had been watching me for months without me knowing. She didn't know me deeply on a personal level, but she observed me at family dinners, at Sunday brunches at her mother-in-law's house, at the social events Bradley insisted we attend to keep up appearances. She was Bradley's sister-in-law, married to his older brother, Richard, a man who pretended to work in consulting but actually blew high stakes in underground gambling rings with money that wasn't his. This woman's name was Audrey. And Audrey had seen things I didn't even know I needed to look for yet. I met Audrey at a coffee shop in Tribeca on a Wednesday afternoon, the October sun slanting through the large windows and low music making it impossible to overhear neighboring tables. I arrived first, wearing a dark trench coat and a posture that had absolutely nothing to do with the hunched, defeated woman the Vance family thought they had broken. When Audrey walked in and saw me sitting like that, her eyes swept over me from head to toe for a full second before she took her seat. It wasn't exactly surprise, it was recognition. Like when someone finds confirmation of a suspicion they were too afraid to voice. She said, without beating around the bush, with no preamble, "I knew you weren't who they pretended you were." I smiled. I told her to go on. What Audrey told me in that cafe changed the scale of the entire operation. Richard, Bradley's brother, was up to his neck in the scheme. He was the physical link in the chain, the bagman who received the document envelopes from the Caymans, extracted what was needed, and shredded the rest. But Richard was impulsive, and impulsive men inside criminal rackets are ticking time bombs. He had lost nearly $800,000 betting over the last 6 months. To plug the holes before Bradley found out, he had started skimming small amounts off the top of their own scheme, which, in that kind of operation, was the equivalent of robbing a mob boss's vault. Bradley had found out. The solution he came up with was simple and brutal. He tightened the financial screws on his brother so hard that Richard had zero room to maneuver. He demanded that Richard put up Audrey's apartment as collateral for a fictitious debt, the apartment that belonged solely to her, that she had bought before they were married, inherited from her father, representing the only materially secure asset she owned in the world. Audrey found out when she went to the county clerk's office for an unrelated matter and stumbled upon a deed with a signature she had never authorized. The forgery was meticulous, a dirty notary, the paperwork filed perfectly, everything tracing back to the exact same law firm where Chloe worked. I wrote the deed registry numbers on the palm of my hand while Audrey spoke, then transferred them to my secure drive the second I walked out of the coffee shop. I told her that not a single cent of her father's property would be lost. That before any transfer could clear, I would place a federal lien on it that no clerk in the state could bypass. She looked at me for a long time before asking, her voice trying to sound casual and failing, "What exactly do you do, Rachel?" I answered her with absolute honesty for the first time in a very long time, not the carefully curated honesty I used with Bradley, but real, clean, uncalculated honesty. I tear down schemes exactly like this for a living. That very night, before any transfer was even attempted, my team issued a preemptive freeze on all accounts and properties tied to Audrey's real estate. We blocked any financial movement connected to the property address, tripped real-time wire alerts, and set up a notification system for our legal team should any instrument be presented to a clerk. Richard woke up the next morning locked out of everything. Bradley didn't even know yet that his brother had just become a loose wire dangling over the edge of a cliff. But there was one thing I still needed. The physical evidence that would make everything bulletproof, the actual cooked ledgers, the offline files Bradley kept in a safe at his mother's house, a sprawling suburban estate in Westchester I had visited dozens of times as a wife, and now needed to visit in a completely different capacity. Audrey confirmed the exact location, described the safe with details only an insider could know, and gave me the physical override code she had caught Richard using one afternoon when he thought he had the house to himself. That safe was the beating heart of it all. And that heart was locked behind a shelf of legal textbooks in Beatrice's home office, the family matriarch, a woman who for 7 years had treated me like second-class hired help inside her own home, and who smirked every time Bradley belittled me in front of company as if it were a sign of good breeding. I walked into Beatrice's house on a Thursday morning, the sun still low and the streets of the gated community completely deserted. The timing was calculated flawlessly. Beatrice had a charity luncheon at the country club that she never cancelled, because social currency was the only currency she truly valued. Richard was across town trying to negotiate with loan sharks, buying time with promises he couldn't keep. And Bradley was at the bank, cocky, arrogant, absolutely convinced I was somewhere in the city begging a lawyer to take my case on contingency or, best-case scenario, scraping the bottom of my allegedly empty bank account. The front door was unlocked for the weekly cleaning crew, exactly as Audrey had promised. I walked in calmly, like someone who had every right to be there. The housekeeper who saw me in the hallway lowered her eyes and said nothing. In my 7 years as the daughter-in-law, I learned that the staff knew far more than they let on, and this woman had clearly seen enough to know when to keep her mouth shut. The office was at the back of the house, down a long hallway that smelled of lemon polish and old paper. It was a room Beatrice used purely to intimidate guests, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a heavy mahogany desk with a green leather top, framed photos of high society galas. The specific bookcase Audrey had described was on the north wall, packed with corporate law treatises that had probably never been cracked open. I found the specific volume. A treatise on corporate entity law bound in brown leather with gold lettering on the spine. I pulled it forward, and that section of the shelf swung open on a silent hinge, revealing the black steel face of a biometric safe bolted directly into the wall studs. Bradley's arrogance made him predictable. He trusted biometrics too much and underestimated the possibility that someone on the inside might know the manual override. I found the sliding panel beneath the scanner, exactly where Audrey said it would be. I punched in the 6-digit code. The deadbolt snapped back with a clean, cold, definitive click. Inside was stacks of cash that didn't interest me. Velvet jewelry boxes that weren't my jurisdiction. And tucked in the back, practically invisible against the dark steel, was a military-grade solid-state drive, rectangular, matte black, stripped of any exterior branding. Small enough to fit in the palm of my hand, large enough to hold enough data to obliterate everything Bradley had ever built. I took only the drive. I locked the safe. I swung the bookshelf back into place. I walked out of the house with the unhurried pace of someone who had just stopped by to grab a forgotten umbrella. Back at Apex, it took my team 14 hours to crack the encryption. What was inside was infinitely worse than anything we had managed to map remotely. Fraudulent retainer agreements bearing Chloe's digital signature on every single page, organized by date, by client, by dollar amount. Wire transfer logs that matched, down to the penny, the deposits we had flagged in the offshore accounts. Internal bank spreadsheets, illegally exported, detailing exactly how Bradley used his executive clearance to integrate the laundered cash into legitimate mutual funds, skimming undeclared commissions off the top of every approved trade. There were also ledgers tracking Richard's casino runs, the underground tables that served as the first layer of the wash before the money moved to the Caymans. It was a complete, vertically integrated criminal enterprise. And I had everything I needed to burn it to the ground. For the next 14 hours, nobody at Apex slept. We cross-referenced every offshore wire against the forged legal documents. We tied the casino payouts to the Cayman deposits. We built an exhaustive, bulletproof timeline of a 7-year racketeering operation. And then we made the final connection, the most crucial one, the one that would elevate this from a civil divorce dispute into a federal RICO violation, the sworn financial disclosure statement Bradley had signed during our mediation, where he swore under penalty of perjury that he held no hidden assets, linked directly to the accounts whose bank statements were currently blanketing my conference table. He hadn't just lied to me. He had lied to the federal government. At dawn, as the sun began to streak across the New York skyline outside our 18th floor window, Forensic Report 402 was finalized. 246 pages. Every single page bearing the red seal of the federal special master in the footer. My signature on the final page, not the signature of Rachel the data clerk, but the signature of Rachel Carter, Juris Doctor and Executive Director of Apex Forensics. The mediation hearing was scheduled by Chloe's firm for a Friday morning, on the 50th floor of a high-rise on Wall Street. I took the subway. I walked into the lobby carrying a faded canvas tote bag, a trench coat I bought 3 years ago at a department store, and sensible flats that didn't make a sound on the marble floors. I kept my shoulders slightly hunched in the elevator. When the receptionist saw me, I saw the judgment wash over her face like a reflex, fast, automatic, devoid of conscious malice. It was just the instinct of someone who worked in that echelon and knew, in a fraction of a second, who belonged there and who didn't. That was exactly the effect I was going for. The conference room featured a dark oak table, leather ergonomic chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows treating the New York skyline as a backdrop for power. Bradley was sitting with his legs crossed and the expression of a man who already knows the final score before the game even starts. Chloe, sitting beside him, had a sleek leather portfolio open and a gold pen in her hand. At the head of the table sat the firm's senior partner, Arthur Sterling, a 60-year-old shark famous around town for dismantling spouses in high-net-worth divorces with the clinical efficiency of a man who bills a premium for it. Nobody offered me water. Nobody stood up to shake my hand. Sterling spoke for 20 long minutes. It was a clearly rehearsed monologue, engineered to bulldoze me before a single counter-argument could be made. He threw around phrases like insurmountable financial reality and lack of litigative capacity. He explained, with the condescending patience of a man explaining algebra to a toddler, that the $30,000 was a generosity I technically had no right to, but that Bradley was willing to offer as a humanitarian gesture. He told me that if I tried to fight this, I would be buried in the discovery phase. That the attorney fees would hound me for the rest of my natural life. That I would walk away from the proceedings owing more than I could ever hope to earn. Bradley watched with his arms folded and a smug satisfaction he didn't even try to hide. Chloe took notes. With every new threat from Sterling, I watched Bradley sink a little deeper and more comfortably into his chair, the unmistakable body language of a man who thinks the war is already over. I let them finish. I didn't interrupt. I didn't protest. I didn't let my face register anything other than careful attention. Then I pulled a single piece of paper from my canvas tote. Simple, folded in half, printed on standard copy paper, the kind you buy at any local office supply store. It was a standard financial disclosure declaration. I asked Bradley to sign it, swearing under penalty of perjury that there were no hidden assets outside of what was declared in the divorce settlement. Sterling immediately began to loudly object. Bradley raised a hand to cut him off. I saw in Bradley's eyes the exact second he decided that signing the paper was easier than listening to me beg. It was just a cheap piece of paper. It was just an emotional security blanket a desperate ex-wife needed to feel validated. Signing it was the fastest way to get me out of the room. He took the paper, scanned the first few lines with a mix of boredom and pity. He signed his name with the gold pen, adding a large flourish, the kind of signature a man uses when he wants you to know he's doing you a massive favor. Chloe, eager to prove her worth in front of the senior partner, opened her portfolio and pulled out her own notary public stamp. She notarized the document with an efficiency that bordered on arrogance. The heavy brass stamp hit the oak table with a dry, definitive thud. I took the paper, folded it meticulously, slipped it back into my tote bag with the exact same calm you use to put away a grocery receipt. I stood up. I said simply, "Thank you for your cooperation." I walked out of the room without looking back, but I clearly heard, as the heavy glass door clicked shut, Bradley telling Sterling that he knew this would be a layup. That people like me were always easy. The hearing at the federal family court was scheduled for the following Monday, at 9 in the morning. I arrived 40 minutes early. I entered the courthouse through the main elevators, strode down the marble corridor with long, measured steps, and slipped into the restroom on the courtroom floor for one final change. The worn coat and the canvas tote were folded away into my backpack. What replaced them was a charcoal, custom-tailored suit with an immaculate cut, a pair of stilettos that struck the floor with the precision of a metronome, and a heavy leather briefcase with a solid steel clasp. My hair, which I had left loose and messy at the mediation, was now pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. It wasn't a transformation. It was a return. From the gallery, as I walked down the center aisle toward courtroom 4B, I heard the sound of Bradley laughing. I smelled Beatrice's heavy perfume before I even saw her. Richard was hovering in the corner, his fingers twitching nervously over his phone, his eyes bloodshot and sunken like a man who hadn't slept more than 2 hours. The entire family had shown up to watch what they fully expected to be a comfortable spectator sport, the public execution of a penniless woman. When I pushed open the swinging doors and walked into the courtroom, the silence was instant. Bradley stopped laughing in the middle of a syllable. His hand, resting casually on Chloe's shoulder in a gesture of possession, slipped off completely. Beatrice's jaw actually dropped. Richard looked up from his screen and froze solid. They were expecting the Rachel of the trash bag luggage. They were expecting the hunched woman from the mediation, with the canvas tote and the cheap flats. What walked through those doors was an entirely different species, and the shock on their faces was the most satisfying thing I had seen in 7 years. I sat alone at the respondents' table. I set my briefcase down with a soft, calculated thud. I popped the steel clasp with a click that echoed through the dead-silent room. Judge Thomas Barrett was 61 years old, with a reputation forged over 3 decades on the federal bench. He was notorious for his absolute zero-tolerance policy on procedural games and a razor-sharp intellect that forgave no sloppiness, not from veteran litigators, and certainly not from litigants who thought they could use his courtroom for personal power plays. Sterling stood up immediately and launched into the speech I was expecting. My lack of legal counsel. My alleged technical incompetence. A motion for summary judgment. He used the phrase, remote clerical worker, with the exact same carefully embedded disdain Bradley used when he wanted to shrink me in front of VIP guests. From the gallery, I heard Beatrice let out a soft sigh of smug agreement. Judge Barrett looked at me over the rim of his glasses and asked if I had a formal response before he ruled on Sterling's motion. I opened the briefcase. I pulled out the bound report. 246 pages, featuring the red seal of the federal special master stamped onto the footer of every page, and right there on the cover, next to my signature. The bailiff carried the document over to the judge's bench in total silence. The sound of his shoes on the wood floor was the only noise in the room. Sterling was halfway through another sentence when he saw the red seal. He stopped dead, stared at the cover. Something in his eyes shifted, not quite terror yet, but the first creeping shadow of a variable that wasn't in his playbook. The judge opened the report slowly. He read the first few paragraphs. By page 3, he lowered his glasses and looked down at Sterling with the highly specific expression of a man watching a situation completely detonate in the face of the guy who thought he was holding the remote. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice not needing to rise in volume to command every inch of the room. You have spent the last 10 minutes of this hearing aggressively demanding that this court rely exclusively on audits from federally appointed institutions. You even went so far as to emphatically name Apex Forensics as the gold standard this court should look to. A perfectly timed pause, paced like a maestro. Do you truly not recognize the woman sitting across the aisle from you? I watched the color completely vanish from Bradley's face. I watched Sterling open his mouth and find absolutely zero words to push out of it. I watched Chloe look at me, truly look at me, for the very first time without the filter of supremacy she had worn since the night she walked around my apartment wearing my clothes, and realize, in a fraction of a second, exactly what the stamp on that report meant for her career, her license, and everything she had ever worked for. Judge Barrett held up the document so the entire gallery could clearly see the crimson seal on the cover. Let the official record reflect, the judge stated, projecting his voice with the absolute certainty of a man who knows his words will be quoted far beyond these walls, that the respondent appearing in this hearing is Rachel Carter, Juris Doctor, Executive Director and Lead Forensic Accountant for Apex Forensics, acting in her official capacity as a special master appointed by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the United States Attorney's Office. The courtroom went graveyard silent. I stood up slowly. There was no rush. The room was mine. I spoke for 15 minutes, with the clinical detachment of a professional, walking through the report section by section, omitting any drama or unnecessary emotion, delivering nothing but the ironclad facts my team had spent weeks assembling. Section 1 detailed the $4.3 million sitting in the Cayman Island accounts, complete with registry numbers, wire dates, and the names of the shell LLCs used as shields. Section 2 showcased the fraudulent consulting retainers bearing Chloe's digital signature, contracts she had personally drafted, weaponizing her bar license to rubber stamp a criminal racket. Section 3 documented Richard's role as the bagman, matching underground casino deposits perfectly against the timestamps of the offshore wires. And then I introduced Exhibit A. I pulled the sworn disclosure statement Bradley had signed at the mediation out of my briefcase, the gold foil of Chloe's notary stamp still gleaming on the right margin. I handed it to the bailiff to deliver to the bench, pairing it with Section 4 of the report, the section that proved, via bank statements and wire logs, that the accounts Bradley had just sworn under penalty of perjury did not exist were actively moving capital at that exact second. He hadn't just lied to me for 7 years. He had hand-delivered his own confession on a silver platter, signed with his fancy gold pen and legally authenticated by the very attorney who was supposed to protect him from making exactly this kind of fatal error. Judge Barrett read in silence for 2 full minutes. The kind of heavy, suffocating silence that no one dares interrupt. Then he closed the binder, folded his hands on the elevated bench, and looked at Sterling with a look that wasn't anger, it was something much heavier. It was the absolute certainty of what had to happen next. Bradley Vance, the judge said, using his full name, a name I had never heard spoken like that in a courtroom, sounding like a prison sentence all on its own. This court notes flagrant, documented perjury committed within this jurisdiction. You have attempted to use the federal judicial system to facilitate and conceal an international money laundering operation. The judge gave a sharp nod to the 2 federal marshals positioned near the double doors, coordinated by my team prior to the hearing, waiting for the exact moment the evidence was formally entered into the record. The metallic zip of the handcuffs locking around Bradley's wrists was the cleanest sound I had ever heard. He didn't fight back. He didn't shout. He just stood there with empty, wide eyes, staring at a patch of empty air, like a man who just realized the floor he had been standing on for 7 years was made of glass, and the glass had finally shattered. Chloe didn't share his composure. When the second marshal stepped toward her, she bolted backwards so violently she dropped her leather portfolio. The papers she had carried with such arrogance scattered across the marble floor like a broken mirror. She started sobbing, not a normal cry, but the hyperventilating collapse of someone who had genuinely believed they were untouchable. She kept stammering that she was an attorney, that she was barred, that she had rights, as if her title could magically erase the tracking data printed on every single page pointing directly at her. Judge Barrett looked down at her with zero visible pity. He stated that the forensic report was being forwarded immediately to the State Bar Association with his personal recommendation for permanent disbarment. Chloe would never practice law in the United States again. Sterling backed away from his table and announced, his voice stripped of its usual booming resonance, that his firm was withdrawing its representation of Bradley Vance, effective immediately. It was the desperate pivot of a man trying to salvage a sinking ship. But the mere fact that the firm's name was permanently inked on the transcripts of this hearing guaranteed months of institutional nightmares, and from the look on his face, the look of a man calculating massive liabilities in real time, he already knew it. From the gallery, I heard Richard jump up and scramble for the side exit. Audrey was waiting for him. She had arrived early and positioned herself exactly where I told her to, looking immaculate in an emerald pantsuit, exuding a calm that fiercely contrasted with the chaos imploding inside the courtroom. When Richard hit the doorway, she stepped in front of him like a brick wall, without an ounce of aggression or theatricality. She just stood there, the prepared documents already in her hand. She pressed the papers flat against his chest with a quiet firmness. It was the finalized divorce filing, attached to a federal injunction freezing every single account tied to his name, including a hard block on any future attempt to leverage her father's real estate. Richard stared down at the paperwork with a look I knew well, the realization that his grand escape plan was a bridge to nowhere. Beatrice was the last to break. For years, she had been the yardstick by which human worth was measured in that family. The gatekeeper who decided who belonged in the inner circle and who was just disposable help. The noise that tore out of her throat when the marshals hauled Bradley through the side doors wasn't a cry, it was something older and deeper, the sound of a structural collapse. She clutched her chest, sitting entirely alone on the wooden bench, drowning in her expensive perfume and heavy jewelry, all of which suddenly looked incredibly cheap in the face of what had just happened. I didn't watch her for long. There was nothing left to see. I snapped my briefcase shut. I stood up in one smooth, totally controlled motion. I walked down the center aisle without rushing, my heels striking the marble at a tempo that didn't speed up for a fraction of a second. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B and walked out into the bright October sun of New York City. Audrey stepped out beside me, adjusting the collar of her coat. The massive stone steps of the federal courthouse cascaded down in front of us, and the avenue below was already buzzing with the normal chaos of a Monday morning, people rushing to work, cabs honking, a city completely oblivious to the empire that had just been quietly executed on the 10th floor. Audrey didn't speak for a long time. We walked down a few steps in silence, the crossbreeze carrying the smell of roasted coffee from a cart on the corner. 7 years, she finally said, her voice low, as if she were tallying up a check. 7 years, I echoed. It wasn't a lament. It wasn't bitter. It was just acknowledging the sheer weight of what we had carried in the dark, weight that could now be dropped on the pavement, permanently, without guilt, without looking back, and without owing a single emotional debt to the people who tried to convince us we weren't strong enough to fight back. What I learned, when the dust finally settled, is that power you never have to announce is the only kind of power no one can ever steal from you. For 7 years, the Vance family wrote a narrative about me based entirely on what I allowed them to see, and when the time came to weaponize that narrative, it became the exact trap that buried them all. Their arrogance wasn't a superpower. It was a blindfold, wound so tight they couldn't see the executioner sitting at their own dinner table for almost a decade. I didn't strike back in rage. I didn't retaliate with emotion. I let the work speak, with the devastating precision work has when it's executed by someone who knows exactly what the hell they are doing. I walked down the final steps feeling the pure, physical lightness of a woman who just dropped 7 years of dead weight. Not euphoric. Not high on revenge. Just grounded in the quiet, absolute clarity of knowing exactly who I am, what I built, where I am going, and knowing that I will never, ever shrink myself again just so someone else can feel big. Now, if you enjoyed this story, click subscribe, and tell me in the comments, which part made your jaw drop? Oh, and don't forget to become a channel member for access to exclusive videos I don't post anywhere else. See you there.